In Chapter 11, we're going to discuss racial cultural identity development, specifically in people of color. So this is the identity development in predominantly marginalized or minority group members. The example or the case study that they provide for you guys is a pretty glaring example of the dissonance that can exist in an individual who maybe struggles with their identity, their heritage, their racial or cultural makeup. And as you can tell, the Asian American woman struggles with the idea of being that Asian piece, that Asian identity, the Asian culture and heritage that is her. And her belief system certainly centers, you can see the centers around the idea that everything needing to conform to white American ideals, values, and even her physical appearance. It's pretty telling. She describes sort of this date. She had a great time with him, but very clearly at the end shuts it down. I can't date someone who's not white. So this is a pretty glaring example of how one's culture and race can be sort of whitewashed by virtue of growing up in this dominant culture that is us in this moment, and how that can cause some disconnect and dissonance and discomfort in an individual who may or may not consciously be struggling with the idea of multiple cultures, ethnicities, and heritages at the same time. So again, this chapter is about racial and cultural identity models. And so, the goal is to provide this framework. The goal of this whole chapter is to provide a framework for really understanding why these models exist and what do they contribute um, to the identity development of individuals in society and, of course, our clients. These models attempt to explain the process of identity development, excuse me, and to identify ways that if the process of identity development is hindered or stifled, that individuals can be harmed by majority group members. And so a couple of things that the racial identity models just generally have contributed is the idea that maybe as counselors or as human beings, but as it relates to us as counselors, we can rely too much on stereotypes. A couple of chapters back, we discussed the need to use stereotypes, but the idea that stereotypes are just that. They are stereotypes and they are generalizations about others in other groups, but we have to also consider within group differences and individual differences. And so while there may be some universal or potentially universal aspects of one group, we have to stop and not assume that the individual sitting across from us is represented by that stereotype or by that generalization. Um, so another contribution is a connection that these models make between sort of early termination or reluctance to stay in treatment by clients in a minority group, directly related to the counselor's inability to respond to the client's cultural identity or process and progression of cultural identity development. So that's pretty glaring. I mean, that looks directly at us and our inability to really stop and consider this person outside of our worldview and outside of our perspective. Another contribution, excuse me, I'm sorry guys, I'm just getting over being sick. Another contribution is the idea of recognizing those sociopolitical influences on identity development. Going back to the case study, what are some of the examples in that case study that the Asian American woman identifies as being larger factors that have shaped her discomfort and disconnect with her identity? What are some of the larger oppressive beliefs and values that have been placed on her from a societal standpoint a political standpoint, a systemic standpoint that have affected her disconnect, dissonance. I don't want to keep saying disconnect because I don't think that's a great word, but her sort of uncomfortableness with her Asian self, that the part of her Asian American self that she reluctantly identifies with. Your book then goes into identifying several very specific identity development models, starting off with Black identity development models. There are several of these models. The most predominant model, the most widely studied, the most widely sort of referenced would be the CROSS model. This is the one that your book describes. It was originally developed during the Civil Rights Movement. Again, this is the more predominant model when you're just specifically looking at a Black identity development model. This is the most widely sort of referenced. Then you have the Asian American identity development models. There were several shortcomings of this. The earlier versions of some of these models, specifically one of the authors of your textbook has his own model and identifies several of those shortcomings. But your book does go into the idea that there are several models that have developed that expand upon and elaborate upon processes and stages of identity development for Asian Americans. The Latino and Hispanic identity development models, again, there are a number of these models. Your book references the Ruiz model. What's interesting about the Ruiz model, is that it offers some suggestions for areas of exploration as a counselor or a helping profession, or interventions. These specific identity development models have paved the way for a more unified identity development model. So the racial cultural identity development model looks at the common theme of oppression throughout different minority groups or marginalized groups as sort of this common theme in the development of identity, in identity development. So it consists of 5 stages or levels of development that oppressed individuals may go through. And that's oppressed individuals, again, across different minority groups. And they may go through these different developmental stages or levels in an effort to understand quite honestly, the oppressive interplay between their cultural identity and the dominant culture. So the process that exists when an individual from a marginalized or minority group tries to figure out my culture versus the sort of oppressive, dominant culture ways and views on me and my development. It includes pretty common beliefs and attitudes that individuals may experience, may feel. But for a counselor, it can lead certainly to a better understanding of your clients. You may have, by being aware of these models, by specifically this racial cultural identity model, development model, you may be aware of some of the common themes and struggles that your clients may be going through as they explore their identity development. Pages 370, I'm trying to think here, 377, counseling implications specific to racial cultural identity development model and the different stages that your clients could be in and or going through. And so this is really important. You are the counselor, and so it's necessary for you to be aware of these stages and to be aware of the role that you have and play with and for your clients. So we'll finish up with chapter 12. And again, I know this is a lot of information this week. So take your time. And again, if you need extra time to work on these assignments and read these chapters, just let me know, and I'm happy to grant that as long as you're genuinely working. So chapter 12 talks about white racial identity development. So while we talked about identity development for marginalized groups and people of color in chapter 11, chapter 12 talks about it specifically for white racial identity. So this chapter discusses in detail just the concept of whiteness. What does that mean? White privilege. We hear about white privilege. We hear about privilege all the time, but what does that mean? How is that gained? How are there expectations of unearned privileges that we don't earn these privileges, yet we reap the benefits of them. And of course, going into specifically white racial identity development models. And I'm just curious, how often have you thought about your whiteness? If you are a member of the dominant group, if you are, let's just say specifically, if you are a white straight male, how often have you thought about that? If you're a white female, how often have you thought about what that means to be a white female? And what does that mean to you? But also, how is your whiteness, you being white, how is that viewed by others, and other individuals who are not white? And the idea that the fact that we are white, your book goes into discussing the idea that if you are white, if you are of the dominant group, this is not lost on other people of color. This is not lost on individuals of marginalized groups. So how did you feel when you read the Black salesman's answer? He essentially said that sort of being white meant that you have the ability to sort of alter reality. What I see and what I experience is certainly not what you see and you experience. We talk about, perception as a perception. Your perception is your reality. But for people of color, their reality is often altered by the dominant group, as we talked about in previous chapters. The idea that the Black salesman goes into discussing the idea that being white means that you can just really kind of own some of these stereotypes. You can live them. You can, then often being upset or mad when called out on stereotypes, or being prejudiced, sort of being really defensive about that. And then lastly, he says incapable, being white means being incapable of seeing how this negatively affects other people. So again, I go back to that question: how often have you thought about your whiteness? I'm using, continue to use the language that's used in the textbook. So there's two predominant, I'm going to wrap up here in just a second. There are two predominant models for white racial identity development. That's Hardiman white racial identity development, and Helms white racial identity development. And so specifically, just touch on Helms. Helms was mentioned in the Broaching article, and I've several of you have asked me about reading more information on on this topic specifically, so I've referred you to the Helms white racial identity development model. This is such an influential model that a measurement has been created that assesses the stages in development in white racial identity development. Again, it's referenced in your Broaching article, and the Janet Helms' work is constantly referred to still to this day, and is pretty prominent and pretty profound in the models of white racial identity development, and just in social justice and advocacy in general. So lastly, I know I'm moving kind of fast. Again, I don't have a whole ton of time to lecture these videos, and I don't think you guys would listen to them anyway. But, the last part of this touches on something that a lot of we've pondered a lot in class. Well, how does one become non-racist? How does one become anti-racist? And, summing it up, you guys are doing a lot of that by truthfully exploring who you are and what it means to be your culture, to be your race, to be your ethnicity, to be your gender, really exploring that and doing the work necessary and change necessary at that individual level. Being an anti-racist steps outside of yourself, and the work there is to end systemic and external racism